Okay, so welcome to the second day of our lunchtime, tea time lectures as part of the Wuhan Academy. For those of you that are joining us from outside of the Academy, this is a student summer workshop, a collaboration between the University of Dundee and the University of Wuhan. And our students, of which there are 26 of them, are working on the design of the extension of the White Deer Spring Farm in Beiluqiang in the foothills of the mountains in Hubei province. And we have a client who talked to us a couple of days ago, and the students are working on a design project which will be exhibited online on the 31st of August. Alongside their design work for the village, we're also experimenting a little bit with VR technology, and we're trying to share information and particularly trying to share a model of the site using some new VR technology called Edify, which is in the process of being developed. At the middle of each studio day, we've invited some very important practitioners and thinkers to come and talk to us and provoke and stimulate and inspire the students. And we've been able to do this because we've had financial support from the British Council, which has an international mobility fund, which has been very generous to give some support to Dundee. And its ambition is to encourage students from the UK to visit China and to help institutions in China, universities, understand how they can internationalize. So this session is an hour and a half. Austin's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we've got time, if people want to discuss. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it's a very simple and straightforward process. If you go to the section saying more on your menu, and you click on that, you will find it gives you an option to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or you want to make a point or disagree with Austin, then please go there and indicate by raising your hand, and then that creates a list which I can just work through. This session is being recorded and it will go online, probably on YouTube. So if you don't want to be known to be here, then please make it clear and don't speak, or just participate through the chat. Just in case you're interested in following the progress of the workshop over the course of the week, there are two places that you can go, which I've indicated on the left-hand side of this slide. First one is Miro, which is a piece of software which we've been using for the last year or so in Dundee in terms of teaching online. And it's basically a great big poster which students can use to occupy their drawings and videos and PDFs. So this week, the students are working in groups, and they've each got an element of this Miro board. So if you go and have a look, you can see what the students are up to on a day-to-day basis. And at the bottom, Wuhan Academy is a blog and a website that we've set up, which the students are updating every day. So if you want to hear about our lecture yesterday, Zoe did a very good review of Oning's speech, and you can get a sense of how the argument and the discussion is developing. We're very, very lucky to have Austin Williams come to speak to us today. Austin is an architect, and he runs the professional practice element of Kingston School of Arts program. He's also prolific in terms of his writing, both in the architectural press and in the mainstream press. And he's particularly well qualified to talk on the subject of China's urban and rural development because he lived in Suzhou and worked at XJTLU University in Suzhou for 6 years, was it, Austin?
Yeah.
6 years. But he's also thought about and written about this and its sort of impact on architectural practice over a long period of time. And I would thoroughly recommend his book, which is China's Urban Revolution, which he produced 4 years ago, if you want to try and grasp a very complex and contradictory process of the impact of urbanization on Chinese life and society. So without any more talk, I'm going to unshare my screen and hand over to Austin. And can I just remind students, we really do want some questions, so think about your questions while Austin's speaking. I think Austin is going to talk about some of the things that Oning talked about yesterday, but from slightly different perspective. And I think Oning made the point that you can't ever talk about the rural without talking about the urban. I think Austin's going to talk about the urban and the rural together, which I think will be very useful. Okay, good.
Great. Thank you very much, Penny. So look, I'm probably going to talk until 1 o'clock or thereabouts. Stop me if I'm talking too much. But I'm going to try and take a look at some of the issues to do with the changes in the shape of China's urbanization discussion. Primarily for the last 20 years or so, we have spoken, or 30 years, we've spoken about China's urbanization. And the countryside has always been a feeder for the urban, whereas now the conversation seems to be taking a little bit of a flip, that there's a less conversation about urbanization. There's much more, since 2011, discussion about how we can maybe renew, how China can renew and repopulate and reinvigorate the rural areas. So this is a picture of Suzhou to the west. I know Jiang Hao, if Jiang's here, welcome. If not, on Saturday, he'll be talking about the film around this area, this kind of urban fringe area, because in some ways that's the reality of Suzhou, the clash between the old and the new, between the rural and the urban, and whether there is in fact a return to the countryside. So this is a picture which I really like. This is 1983 in Shanghai. This is looking at Pudong from Shanghai main area, and obviously the fact that there was no so-called nothing there. Obviously, thousands of people living there, but that's what it is now. This is a picture taken in 2016. Obviously, the tower was completed 2017. So you know, that rapid urbanization within 40 years to create this kind of new city development is what has been seen especially in the West, as incredibly impressive, speedy, rapid development. You can get anything built, etc., etc. Nothing is going to constrain the way that we can actually urbanize. But obviously, the impact of some of these strategies on village life, on community life, on settlers who have to be moved off the land, etc., has been something of a marginal conversation. Partly, you have to recognize, as I do, that you know it's one of those consequences in some ways of progress, of development, that there will be uncomfortable realities facing ordinary people. So I'm not diminishing that, but I am recognizing the fact that you know, throughout history, whether it's Western or Asian history, this has happened on a regular basis. So we don't want to get too tied up in you know, bemoaning or missing what went before. But at the same time, it's worth recognizing that there has been some changes which have been significant on that society. So I just put this one in just so you can recognize. So that image of Pudong, the red, if you can see my cursor, the red is Pudong. That's the airport. And this is Nanhui, new area, which is actually now rapidly being built. I went there 6 years ago for the book. And there was almost nothing there, and I didn't think it would actually succeed. But you know, it's actually being created as part of Shanghai's 1966 20-year master plan strategy. This kind of yellowish area here is what I just showed you of Nanhui. This up here is the Pudong area. So the city center of Shanghai, as it expands, And as we know, Shanghai, one of the most populous cities in China, in the world, has got a strategy for how you might cope with additional in migration, but also how it can be seen as a bit more of a global city, and how it can develop and expand with a strategic overview. So it actually isn't just thousands of millions of people arriving in the city to overcrowd it, but there is a strategic understanding about it that you have to cope with and cater for an inrush of people. So 1966 means one center, 9 cities, 60 towns, and 600 villages. That's the strategic overview from 2000 to 2020, obviously just completed. So within that, there will be, the famous German town, Anting. There's the terrible, what's it called? London. I can't remember what it's called now. Thamestown, of course, yes, the awful Thamestown. So there's a whole range of things which work and don't work. A lot of the ones that were designed by Western architects are a bit naff. The one that was designed by a Chinese architect is actually quite interesting. But this area down here, which is predominantly built by or designed by, master planned by German architects, actually does have a little bit of a freshness to it, because it's actually tying into an industry on offshore fishing and port and oil. And it's actually kind of creating a new community. Whether it succeeds or not, because it is a rival now to main Shanghai, is up for grabs. And I think that's part of the conversation. This is a conversation rather than a lecture. So it's, what do you think about these things? Do you think this is necessary? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's successful? Do you think it's going to take away from Shanghai's development or add to it? So if you take a look at Shanghai proper, China proper, you can see that the vast majority of the land mass is what has been characterized in the West as empty, but just 9% of the population live in this huge area over here, and you have around about 90% or so living in just 1/3 of the land. So 2/3 occupied by 9% of the population, 1/3 occupied by 90%. And that kind of eastern seaboard conversation from kind of Guangdong all the way through to Shanghai, up to Beijing, Tianjin, is where that major development is going. And what are the repercussions for that? Because, I mean, a lot of this area in the central portion is desert, is forest, is almost uninhabitable, mountain ranges. But there is a lot of potential for development and for creating a certain sense of place. So the population density, you can see on a global map, is still phenomenal. I mean, we're not talking in the same way as all of China being incredibly dense. It is predominantly within this kind of eastern third, but at the same time, it's a remarkable fact, the number of people living in such a small space, and this area here, which is untouched in some ways. You have the predictions that by 2030, that the population will peak in China at 1.5 billion, at which point, coincidentally, India will carry on rising, partly due to its lack of development. China will, because of its development, will be able to satisfy its demand through reducing population, whereas India, because of its labor-intensive economy, will have to kind of carry on growing. So India will surpass China in population at around about 2030. As a matter of fact, China seems to be peaking at around about 2026, so it may even be earlier than previously thought. And then you have the situation of urbanization as to how you house all of these people, how you create a dynamic economy and a civilized and advanced society. And predominantly that's been done through, across the world, that you urbanize. The most imaginative, progressive, innovative arenas for a creative and a dynamic economy tend to be urbanized regions. So the creation of more cities has been fundamental to the project of China's development, especially as you can see from this graph, since the 1980s. The rate of growth of urbanization has gone incredibly. So from around about 11% urban in 1980 to 65% urban today, it's been an incredible ride. The plan has always been to reach around about 70% urban. Whether that actually happens or not is fundamental to this conversation and to the Chinese political and urban strategists. But I just want to take one quick look at this point. If you can see my cursor at around about 1960, you have this, this is China's urbanization. So the gradual urbanization rising from the foundation of the People's Republic in 1949 all the way through to the 1960s. Then you see this kind of strange little dip, which you don't see anywhere else in global urban history. So urbanization went backwards somewhat. So what you find is that, as I say, 1949, there were 120 cities in China. 1957, so kind of 10 years later, you have another 50 cities or so. There's 176 cities. And then 1982, another 30 years later, you have a rise of cities, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see this gradual increase, as you saw on that previous graph. But what's interesting and worth considering is that, 5 years further on, you have another 40 cities or so in 1962. And then 1965, you have this statistic which says that suddenly 40 cities disappeared, which, is an interesting thing. They weren't wiped off the map. They weren't, there wasn't a major explosion. It's more the fact that there was this kind of reclassification of what an urban dweller is, and therefore what an urban realm is. If you classify a city on the basis of, let me start that again. There are kind of three ways of understanding what a city is in urban demographics from the 1940s and 50s, when this science really kind of came into being. One is that it's the number of people living in an area, yes, the mass of people. Another one is the lack of rural dwellers, so it's an opposite. Urban is opposite to rural. So, you're talking about the fewer rural people, then the more you have an urban environment. And the final way of understanding what a city is its kind of civilizational urbanity, the idea that you might have, businesses, you might have culture, you might have opera, you might have parks, all that kind of things, which you don't really have in a rural environment. So those differences between the numbers between the opposite to rurality and the cultural development are three distinct ways of differentiating between urban and rural. The fact that to talk about cultural gain in a quantitative way is too difficult. So very few demographic urbanists use that model. What tends to happen is people tend to talk about numbers and classifications of urban and rural. So in China, obviously, with the introduction slightly earlier of the hukou system of classification between you being a rural dweller or you being an urban dweller, the fact that you can, at a stroke, change your certification and change the designation from an urban to rural meant that the numerical understanding of what a city was changed. So you could almost, as is the case here, by pushing people back to the countryside, the numbers went down. By reclassifying people as rural dwellers meant that you lost the number of cities. So that's really the kind of rationale behind the disappearance of 40 cities, and then obviously they start to grow once again. Bring it back to more contemporary situation, just 8 or 9 years ago. This is an article from a UK newspaper, but it's everywhere in the world, that the idea that China is racing to move millions of people out of the countryside. Yes, that was the general idea, that you're taking you're developing a new modern economy, that China was advancing, that it was urbanizing at an incredible pace. It was building 400 new cities. That was the rhetoric, and therefore trying to move as many people as possible from the poor, backward, peasant-based countryside into the new dynamic China of the future. That was just 9 years ago. What was actually happening was not that they were building all these new cities, which is what everybody in the West assumed they were, but they were, again, reclassifying, but also, transforming, small towns into mid-sized cities, big cities into mega cities, etc. So it was still an impressive thing, yes, this kind of transformation of cities. But in fact, if you look at the stats, there were kind of 23 big towns created, and there were 4 cities created, new cities. But obviously, what I'm saying is you were turning an existing city into a much bigger city. So it was still impressive, but it isn't as if what we imagine in the West, that China was building cities after city, left, right, and center all over the country. That was very rarely the case. It was more of a kind of transformational thing. So Ordos or Ordosa in Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, is one case in point of a new city. Yes, this was built from scratch, from nothing. Similarly, we have Tianjin Eco City, about 80 kilometers from Beijing. That again was a new city. Basically, there was nothing there, villages, farms, etc. But a new city was being created. But predominantly, what you tend to have is this kind of expansion. So this is Suzhou, where, as Penny said, I lived for quite some time. This is the historic central district, a UNESCO heritage area. And then it expanded, as general over history. But then you find this is the Singapore Suzhou Industrial Park. This is the SND. And as you can see, it's actually, this was drawn maybe 10 years ago. This was drawn 5 years ago. You can see that the SND actually has continued much more widely. So that is effectively the old city of Suzhou. And you can see even the Singapore Industrial Park is twice the size and is effectively a new city, but you wouldn't classify it as such. Anyway, you get the gist. Yes. So new cities do not necessarily mean building nothing from scratch. Oh, look, there's my book. You can read about it there. And that's another book which actually is very useful, Ghost Cities of China, which I think was written about 2013, 14 by Wade Shepherd, which actually challenges the myth of ghost cities in China, challenges the idea that, everywhere else in the world, cities emerge organically. That, you might have crossing points, roads. Glasgow is a case in point, but it's across the board that you actually find that small settlements suddenly take hold, people move to them because there's business opportunities, etc., and they organically grow. China has been the first place really in the world to build some cities from scratch. And so when people were complaining that they were empty, it misunderstands the dynamic. Yes, you're building a city and then you're moving people into it rather than what normally happens in an organic urban setting. Anyway, so that just to clarify the idea of a city, which I think is worth discussing, or at least the students here thinking about, that when we talk about a city, it's worthwhile trying to understand what it is that we're talking about. Is it a city center? Is it the sprawl? And this is a really interesting book by Robert Brugman. So when does a city start? When does it end? When is it a peri-urban? When is it et cetera, et cetera. So the population contained within the contours of a contiguous territory inhabited at urban levels of residential density. These are very boring definitions, but like I say, the key thing, because it's one of the easiest ones, is that the United Nations very regularly defines urban areas by numbers. Yes, the United States defines an urban area as anything up greater than 2,500 people. I mean, think about it, 2,500 people in a Chinese context is quite remarkable. New York University classifies 100,000 people as an urban expansion area. European Commission defines it slightly differently. I think somebody's got their mic on. Not that I mind, but recording's not good. And then again, United Nations city definitions, Ethiopia defines it as greater than 2,000 people, Benin, more than 10,000 people, etc. So if you take a look at the picture on the right-hand side, that's Foxconn factory in Shenzhen, that has around about 300,000 people in it. Yeah, and remember, America says anything greater than 2,500 people is a city. So what is that? And that makes a factory into a major city. And then another classification which says, which again is on the political level. So all of these things have a statistical scientific narrative, but that then they are challenged and colored by politics. It says if India's national authorities would classify populations of 5,000 or more as urban, the country would be considered predominantly urban and not rural. And obviously, anybody thinking about India, you wouldn't call it an urban country, yes. But because it's so dense, and as we saw from the atlas, it's so densely populated that small villages are just packed much greater than what you would think of as an American city. So politically, you can't allow India to consider itself an urban country because that would undermine America's position to be in urban leadership. So there's all kinds of political games being played here. Yes. So what is a city? You know, you have to think about these things. What is a city? In China's terms, obviously we talk about urban areas, metropolitan areas, administrative areas, as classifying what it means to be urban. So Chongqing is regularly discussed in its overall context as the city of Chongqing. Chongqing, the city, has 8 million people, which is a big city. That's the size of London. Yes, but very often it's characterized as having 32 million people because that's the administrative area to be considered, which takes in a huge area of agricultural land, which contradicts the conversation about urban rural distinction. Yes, how can you have an urban area where around about 75% of the land area is agricultural? So again, worth thinking about. And then the final thing, I suppose, in terms of just the confusion or the interesting discussion that you can have about what an urban area is or what a city is when you start talking about urban clusters, about business districts, not central business districts, but business conglomerates, where cities come together to maximize their economic or their productive potential. The most obvious example, I suppose, is Xiang'an in just outside Beijing, the President Xi's great vision of the new city, which kind of is bringing together 3 different provinces, but you're kind of tying together Wuhan, Changshan, Nanchang in a kind of a more dynamic potential. You can see what's going on with Shenzhen and Zhuhai with the new bridge and bringing Hong Kong. So all of these kind of areas now suddenly become one big metropolitan soup. And it's kind of, you've had it for many years in America. It's kind of tying these, the Silicon Valleys, these kind of new dynamic West Coast developments. So what does it mean to be a city in that dynamic environment? Anyway, think about it. And finally, what does it mean to be a city anyway? So on the left-hand side, you have Tianfu in Chengdu, which is designed. This is the original master plan. It doesn't look like this, obviously, as anybody from Chengdu will tell you. Designed by Smith and Gill, American architects, the master plan. That's, in some ways, how you imagine kind of a city. Do you know what I mean? A new dynamic city hub. On the right-hand side, you have St. David's in West Wales, where I'm from, which has a population of 1,800 people. That is classified as the smallest city in the world, but it's a city. Now, what's the similarity between those 2 things? Is St. David's a city? Is it nonsense to call it a city? You can decide. But I just wanted to bring in part of, I don't know whether you've been taught this stuff or whether I'm telling you stuff you already know, but Ebenezer Howard, one of the earliest thinkers and most profound thinkers on new urban settlements, with his book, Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, which just 2 years later, 4 years later, sorry, became The Garden Cities of Tomorrow. It's the same book, essentially, just got changed the name. But he was a bureaucrat who actually started to think about what it would mean about urban expansion, people that were coming into the cities and leaving behind the countryside. And he had the vision that, you know, in the old days, lots of people would be living in the city center in this dense, polluted environment. And then they were living in the suburbs. People moved out from the city center to escape from those kind of dreadful conditions. But they kind of lived in the suburbs and still drove in or traveled into the city, into the terrible conditions. He was thinking, why don't we build a new city which has kind of not pollution, but nature at its center? And that could be a transformative moment. And that gave rise to the city of Welwyn Garden City. If you have a chance to visit it, it's well worth a look even today. But that was the transformation. You see, from the industrial, 20th century in the UK, those kind of conversations about urban conditions were prevalent, similar to what you might find in China today or in the last 10 years. Again, I'll show you this one, which I think is interesting in terms of Chicago. Again, if you get a chance to see Chicago, I think it's one of the best cities in the world. Chicago was a city which was devastated by a fire in the 1870s, where 1/3 of the city was demolished, and they started to rebuild it. And human ingenuity meant that instead of, in some ways, kind of running away from the problems, they were going to create a new urban environment, done by this man, Daniel Burnham, and he started to talk about the City Beautiful movement. So where Chicago had been this city of narrow streets, incredible pollution, congestion, disease, ill health, it was a very crowded, bustling, dirty city. The idea that Chicago had reached a sufficient position of economic and social development that it could now use some of that money to maybe give something back to ordinary people and to transform the city from this kind of polluted environment to a beautiful one. So this white city idea, which a lot of it was all kind of fake just for show, but got millions of visitors to come along to take a look at what a new city could be. Yes, instead of just having crowded, you could have wide spaces, you could have lakes, you could have parks, beautiful cultural conditions, open air, clean air, people can walk and stroll, and it's a much more humane city. Wide open boulevards, trees, fountains, etc., etc. Yes, so this was something which was very important. And if you see what's happening with the conversation, admittedly, this is an American understanding of China, but the idea about people, especially the more wealthy people in Beijing, in the polluted environments of urban areas, were moving out to the suburbs and moving further out. And that's really what the Shanghai Expo, Better City, Better Life, was also trying to do, was talking about how you can possibly try to now create a little bit of that rural or countryside or park environment within the city. In China, as in Chicago, the city had developed really rapidly in order to create a dynamic economy. Once it had reached a certain point, it was allowed to develop a more environmentally friendly, human-friendly environment, and it was introducing parks. Beijing, Shanghai, these cities developed incredibly rapidly in the same way to progress Chinese economy forward. And by 2011, 12, there was a conversation within China about how can you now transform these very bustling, congested, busy, dirty streets into something more palatable. So Beijing has a a park strategy to introduce more parks. Shanghai is discussing, eco cities and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a very similar conversation going on 100 years apart. I think it's kind of worthy of note. Just to emphasize the Ebenezer Howard strategy, if you haven't read this or studied this, if you have, apologies, but if you haven't, it's worth kind of taking a look at. It's a very influential book. It's a very boring book, but it's an incredibly influential strategic understanding that, the town has, employment opportunities, it has social opportunities, but it has, foul drafts, it has costly drainage, it doesn't have much sun, it has lots of slums, so the town has positives and negatives. The countryside has a lack of society, has a lack of engagement, but it has, the beauty of nature. It doesn't have any work opportunities, but it does have clean air and sunshine. So the countryside has positive and negatives. And then by trying to bring it together, he tries to introduce kind of the good of both sides into the urban environment, which I think is something, if people here are involved in designing or thinking about urban strategies, it's a good starting point. And that's what his theoretical model came to be, this idea of a city center, and you have satellites. So you start to strategically think about expansion. And so you want to grow, you can form new satellites and plug into the existing, which I think is a proposal which has been developed for many years since. I'll skip that, but you can see these are some fanciful ideas within China for new urban developments. They haven't been realized yet, but you can see their origins. Yes, the same way. The circular economy, circular cities is a very kind of popular vision. This is Dilla Scofidio, which won a competition, but it hasn't been built yet. I know. And then this is a proposal which again is trying to unite that idea about urban and rural. It's by Bill McDonough in Huangbayu, where I won't tell you the full story because it's available for you to read about. I think it's important to read about that he went to this area. A cousin or a daughter of Deng Xiaoping was involved in trying to get him to design a new environmentally friendly large town in the middle of nowhere in Liaoning, and the local people were delighted because they saw these drawings. They didn't see this. You see, there's a little. Can you see that there? There's a little man on the roof picking rice. So what he was doing was taking the existing agriculture and lifting it up in the air, and then creating this city underground. When people realized that they were still going to be farmers picking, crops, and other people would be working in the shiny new offices, they were so angry that they chased him out of town, and the project never got built. A matter of fact, well, there he is. That's his famous book. The fact is that that's what actually got built. That was around about 2011 or so. I went there 2016, and that's what it is. So basically, everybody threw him out. All they could build were these houses, which nobody can afford. So they use them just as extra garden space, and the whole place is derelict, empty. It's taken up a huge area of land. So the idea has to be strategically thought out, rather than just a publicity stunt, is what I'm trying to say. Don't bring in an American architect who promises you everything and then can deliver nothing, because he didn't have the ability to bring that industry to the city. So what ended up was the environmental conversation became a devastating impact on the village. It took up around about 30% of the land, destroyed lots of the crop areas, and the village hasn't really recovered. Anyway, you can read about it in this document. Shannon May is an American who was in the town at the time, and she's written a book on it. Very interesting. Anyway, I suppose my final thing, which may also tap into what Oning was saying yesterday, is about the impact of migration and transportation on this conversation about urban and rural. Because obviously what you have at the moment is migrant workers is what you've had for the last 30 years. Migrant workers leaving the village areas, the countryside, their farms in order to come to the city to, get more wealth, to get more consumer goods, and to take them back to the village areas, but have a kind of a separate life. Out of that, obviously, there are problems of families that have been left behind, of villages that consist of old people and children, and the adults' influence has been left behind, has been avoided. You have lots of family breakup. There are social problems which are unwritten about as a result of millions of people leaving their villages for months and months at a time. But you have a question about why people migrate. One is the pull, the push-pull idea. So one is the pull of the city offering people better wages, better conditions, that you can actually improve your life. The push, what's making people leave anyway, is the fact that there's land shortages, that there's labor surpluses, etc. Right, and the fact that there's no economic potential for growth. It's also, migration is influenced by age, and the fact that there's now a much older migrant workforce means that that's having an impact on the lack of migration or the reduction in migration today. But the location where you are in that urban environment, whether you own the land and your farm or whether you are renting, etc., etc. So there's a whole range of things which are pulling people from the villages into cities, and things which are kind of pushing them away. And how you confront that, I think, is a very important point. So this is a map from 2014, so things have completely changed, or substantially changed. But the movement down predominantly Guangdong, obviously Beijing, Shanghai, but even going into Jiangsu is kind of quite important. But going, large numbers of people now also going up to Xinjiang for business and factory and farming opportunities. But in general, there's a movement of millions of people. 282 million people in 2013 were moving from their place of residence into other areas. So you can imagine that has a detrimental effect on the countryside, and it has a transformational effect on the urban environment as well. This is taken from 10 years ago, looking at migrant population movement. You can see this kind of steady rise, but I just put this one in, which was taken from 2020. The graphs change at this point, 2014, but in general, you can see that there's a steady rise up to a high point of 290 million people migrating. And for the first time for 30 years, that number fell in 2020. Now that's 2019, 2020. So it's partly due to the COVID pandemic, but it's also partly due to things like, as I said before, an aging migrant worker population that is not prepared or fit and able to move. Fewer younger people are migrating because they're born and remain in cities. And also the idea that part of the rural, or the ruralification, if that's a word, the countryside development is starting to kick in. So this is important. So as I say, from 2011, there was a discussion in the party, Chinese Communist Party, to improve the conditions within the countryside, because it was a generally accepted, recognized fact that the migration was having a detrimental impact. So by 2011, they started to talk about maybe improving the conditions, building better schools, and giving people more opportunities. This is one of the consequences. Reverse migration is picking up. Official figures shown that 1.6 million more people sorry, it showed that last year's 1.6 million more people than in 2019 returned to the countryside to start businesses and not to return. So it's normally a cyclical annual project that people will go back home and then they'll go back to the city after Spring Festival, but more people are staying. And also there's other factors like Beijing, Shanghai are kind of having population caps, saying that 23, 25 million people in Beijing, Shanghai, and therefore they are in some ways encouraging, shall we say, people to go back to the countryside by offering them inducements. So again, push-pull back to the villages rather than push-pull to the city. And what's the consequence or the culmination of this has been just, 2 months ago, the Rural Development Promotion Law has come into force in China, which actually pushes a whole series of policies. It's a big document which looks at how you can bring industrial development and almost urbanize. They talk about urbanizing the countryside, how you can bring places of cultural inheritance. Remember, I was saying the difference between rural or how you define a city is by its cultural development. They're now trying to promote cultural inheritance, trying to promote traditions and crafts within those areas, giving a little bit more opportunity for economic dynamism, that there's an integration between urban and rural so that businesses within cities can subsidize and aid people within rural areas, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole raft of legal measures now being brought in by the party to encourage people to stay behind, and a revitalization board, as it's called, Revitalization Bureau, was opened just the beginning of this year. So you have the 5 major revitalizations as part of this legal strategy, which is industrial development, so helping farms grow. So going from those very small family farms, they're not making them into Mao collective farms, but they are trying to industrialize and bring industrial techniques on a much bigger scale to make it much more efficient. Talent support, so recognizing people who do have talents who very rarely get to show them off because they're not able to go to the city, people who may not have done well in the Gaokao, people who may not have the same educational background, but still have talents. So there's an active support of that. Cultural inheritance, again, with minority nationalities, they're doing it, but also more broadly. Ecological protection, which is basically creating jobs and creating dynamics by saying save forests, don't chop it down, rotate the crops, etc., and promoting that as a dynamic economic opportunity in its own terms. And obviously, when that saving crops or shrubs or forests impacts on farmers because they may want to grow, but then they're restrained by ecological significance, then they will be subsidized. So they will get payments in order to protect the environment rather than to destroy it. And then organization and construction. So again, just to make sure that there are party officials, party cadres, who are, and more broadly, people buy into this strategy. So it has a long-term impact. They want to bring in a harvest festival for farmers. This is all written into the legal framework, improving the revitalization assessment. Everything becomes a tick box to make sure that it's achieved. Regulations for protection, which is part of the ecological conversation. Educating more people in agricultural work, which again is like not going to university, but recognizing that there are skills and training which can advance people's ambitions and opportunities. And farmer relocations. So again, that might be combining different farms. It might be moving people around just to make sure that it increases the efficiency of the opportunities. I mentioned the compensation. You also have the fact that They are stating, the Chinese government states that it achieved its ambition of eradicating extreme poverty. That was stated in the early days of Xi Jinping. They're saying that it's been achieved. Discuss what does extreme poverty mean? You can have that conversation if you wish. It's worthwhile having. It wants to expand the domestic market, as you can tell, especially with COVID, but also in China's autarkic mentality anyway. There is a sense of wanting to encourage, production within industrial arenas, but then who do you sell it to? Urbanites have lots of washing machines and fridge freezers. People in the countryside don't have any. So there's a market, an untapped market that they want to try and protect. And on a domestic market, it avoids you having to deal with international trade. And rural areas, quotes, have a huge space and a lot can be done. So again, there's a potential for creating solar farms, for creating industrial farms, who knows? So there's an untapped potential which has been realized. And it also reinforces the idea of stopping people traveling to the urban areas, because at a certain point, you can't, as far as China is concerned, the argument is that you can't have a 100% urban country. You need to have that self-sufficiency in agriculture, which China has historically relied upon, as well as the peasant, the farmer within Chinese political recent contemporary history has played a massive role. So you don't want to lose that certain sense of what the countryside represents in the Chinese mentality. So you're now trying to encourage people to stay rather than for the last 30 years, you've encouraged people to leave, which is a really interesting turnaround and what you can offer people. So the legal plan is rebuilding that relationship, but giving priority to rural development. Yes, giving priority. That's an important catch-all. Ending poverty, having systems to make sure that that is maintained. Rapidly developing rural areas, so making sure that there's food security, again, reinforced by the COVID pandemic, but fundamental to the Chinese state mentality since the Japanese War and beyond. Improving rural infrastructure and services, unifying urban and rural social security. So this has very great impact on hukou as well, which hasn't really been kind of discussed, but again, worthwhile thinking about. Promoting rural communities and integrating rural and urban construction land market. Yes, I mean, this is a really important one that actually, well, we can talk about that, but it's actually quite an interesting new shift. Rural modernization argues for supply side agriculture rather than demand side agriculture, infrastructure and economy and community restoration. And then urban and rural areas to have the same level of development, including income, infrastructure, public services and opportunities. So this is now built into law. Urban and rural areas to have the same level of development. Now, you could say, what on earth does that mean? How can a rural area have the same level of development? I don't really know the answer to that, but it'd be intriguing to find out how it might play out. So one of the things about this kind of shift is that urban infrastructure, economic dynamism, in the center to the moving this economic dynamism further over on that original map I showed you into those kind of less developed areas, reconstruction, better rural areas, etc., etc. But the questions, which I think you should think about, I have more slides. This is not the end of the show, but I'll be very quick now. Growth in transport infrastructure and mobility. So the idea that all this infrastructure has been built in China, very supremely impressive infrastructure, encouraging people to move, but now you're encouraging people to stay. So is there a tension between that, history of the last 30 years and the development of rail networks, etc., etc.? Does it have impacts on the hukou if you have such readily available transportation and mobility opportunities, etc.? And will people settle? So if you're encouraging people to stay in the countryside, is that a convincing argument? Because you can still see that even though in the last kind of 50 years the economic development has been incredible, GDP per capita, you can still see that it's, it's the eastern seaboard is still way in advance, and some of those regions in the west are still waiting to catch up. The urban population, the rural population crossed over at that point in 2011, or 2013, I think. And you can see that the urban income is different to the rural income. So there's a huge kind of disparity that's going to have to be challenged. And I don't believe that there's going to be a match between those two, however much the Chinese government say that they're going to try to achieve it. So there will always be this pull. Yes, remember, not necessarily the push perhaps, but the pull will be if you want to kind of get a better life, better income, better city, better life, if you remember the Expo quote. So this is a rhetorical headline from the New York Times, I think, saying China urges mass migration back to the countryside. And this was a building in Yunnan that I went to see 5 years ago or so, which actually won an award designed by Hong Kong University, trying to restructure, re-envision what remote rural areas could possibly be and give them some sense of purpose. So this is reinvigorating tourism, funnily enough, in remote areas. But you got some interesting architecture again from 2011, when the countryside became a really important central focus for the government, where they were strategizing how can you encourage people to stay in villages. A lot of money for architects and for urbanists and for development consultancies and academics was promoting rural architecture. So you have Liuan Library by Li Xiaodong. You have Wang Wei, again, developing in the countryside. You even have Chen Haoru, who actually built a pigsty. Yes, an architect designed pigsty. So there's a lot of money in promotion to try to look at quality within the countryside to encourage people to stay. That it's not, it's not run down. It has potential. This is just a very quick little graphic. If you just watch it, looking at the development of rail networks since 2008. Up for 10 years, and this kind of massive network of high-speed rail, right? So China has more high-speed rail than all the countries in the world put together. But what does that mean? What was it for? What does it mean for a sense of place, for a sense of locality, for people staying where they're born or where their hometown is? Because you tend to find that let me just show you, that's 2035, the entire rail network in China. This is not just high-speed rail, this is all rail. And then you can see the rail network spreading out now. And if you look at what happened in the UK, that was the rail network 60 years ago. And very shortly, that's what the rail network becomes. So there's a shrinkage because that's the sense of the purpose of the rail network wasn't there any longer because more people had cars. So there was this idea that the car was the solution to the problems of slow rail networks, etc. That the car was providing more mobility and therefore you didn't need the rail network. Question then is, in China, is the same thing kind of happening? Because high-speed rail is destroying lots of villages that we're now talking about protecting. That is bypassing lots of villages. So some villages are becoming less economically dynamic because the infrastructure is bypassing them, not staying with them. And actually, that final point here is that many lines look incapable of repaying their interest on the debt to build the lines. Some lines are even unable to pay for the electricity costs for running the service because the usage of the rail network is actually kind of quite low. Just 13% of the total of all travelers use a railway. Yes, 75% still use the car. So you have, airports being built, opportunities to travel. Is the railway the best way to get around a massive country like China anyway? And what impact will that then have on the way that we understand the countryside? So conclusion, there is no conclusion. Travel revolution is a process of migration. Question is actually where the push and the pull occurs. For migrants, there's always an economic need to be, can that be catered for in small towns or villages? Or will they always move to the city? Will the far west of China be a sufficient pull, or will they always want to go to Shenzhen, Guangdong, Shanghai, Beijing? And then the final point is on what transport means, mobility means, is an ambition to see the world, to travel, to move to bigger and better things. Staying in your village is never a symbol of progress and ambition. It's always a symbol of staying put and stagnant ambition. So most people, especially most young people, will always want to leave. Maybe some of the older people will want to stay. So is this a division in society on age terms, on ambition terms, as well as just on simple technical infrastructure terms? And that, I'm sorry to have been 5 minutes over what I said I would, but that, ladies and gentlemen, is your lot. Thank you very much. I will happily take questions.
Thank you so much, Austin. That was a tour de force. And it was really interesting that you were talking about a lot of the things that Oning talked about yesterday, but from a completely different perspective, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. I've got a few questions, but I'm really keen to find out whether other people have questions. Can everybody just put their camera on just for a little bit so that Austin can get a sense of who he's talking to for a minute? Could you all just put your cameras on? Some of you put your cameras on.
Hey.
See some human beings.
Real people.
Gary's had a haircut. Hi.
Hello everyone. Nice to see you.
Right. Okay.
I was looking forward to seeing Beloved. I had somebody called Beloved on my screen. That was interesting.
Beloved.
Ah, there we go.
There she is. Yeah.
There we go. Very good.
Okay. I think there must be questions or points of disagreement, or from a Dundee student point of view, we haven't discussed Hukou, however you pronounce it. So Austin can say a little bit more about that, or maybe somebody from China can say it just to explain to people that don't know what that means.
You haven't got to be nice. You can give me some grief if you want. I mean, I'm sure there's bits you don't agree with, or if there's bits you want clarifying, just, anything you want, I'm happy to give it a go.
Yeah, so it can be as basic or complex a question as you want to raise. So I'm thinking that people should raise their hands, but I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think that you just turn the mute off.
Look, Maya.
Maya, great.
Well done.
Well done, Maya.
Break the ice.
Go ahead, Maya.
I was wondering, with the development of these high-speed railways, do you think you can coexist in cities and villages, or is this too disruptive to the community life and ruins the atmosphere of the place?
Well, I mean, the thing about high-speed rail is that it's about intercity travel, really. And those cities are huge distances apart. So you're bypassing a lot of these places. So the high-speed rail doesn't really impact upon villages in the middle of a high-speed rail network. One of the things which it's interesting, and actually a design question, which hasn't been confronted by the Chinese rail network, is how you might, for example, if you have a line, let's say between Shanghai, just for the sake of argument, between Nanjing and Beijing, okay, and you're flying past lots of villages. What if some of those villages become small towns, become large towns, become small cities, right, and develop, and they want to then tap into that high-speed rail network? How do you build a station that actually can take some advantage of that existing rail network? Because, or are you going to be historically always, problematized by the fact that the infrastructure missed you? So that's a really interesting kind of, plug on railways, a la Archigram or whatever it might be, could be quite an interesting thing. Or whether you dip down. If you go to a place like Daqing in northeast China, which is a fascinating city, and I'm actually planning on doing some writing on Daqing. So if anybody out there, even you, Penny, anybody's interested in kind of helping, it would be very interesting. But Daqing developed as a city which is split in half because you have the South Railway, you have the North Railway, and what they did in the 1960s, they discovered oil right in the center of the city. So the city became an oil field, and the city became just literally broke in two because you can't build anything on the oil fields. So now you lost the city center, but you have two wings, and they bring their high-speed rail in, and they actually dips down almost like sidings, dips down into the city and rises back up again. Anyway, I think I might be diverging from your real question, which is, are they being marginalized? And yes, they are. And that's part of this strategy about how you can reinvigorate a sense of place, which then doesn't need to tap into the existing infrastructure because they can't. So how can you make people satisfied with what they've got? Now, I mean, where you come at this is up to you as to whether you think it's really good to reinvigorate the rural, or whether you think, rurality is a little bit backward and parochial. That's a philosophical, political question as much as it is an architectural one. And how you then you can define, once you've kind of understood where you stand on the matter, then you can work out a strategic plan to maybe resolve it. What China is trying to do is to say, look, you can't bring every village up to urban standards. You can't allow every village to become emptied out by bringing people as migrants to urban centers. Therefore, you have to content people with what they've got. And to do that, set up some businesses, give them a bit more of a stake in their locality. And that will make them, reinvigorate the place. It's a sensible, reasonable, economic, pragmatic decision, like all Chinese decisions. But do you agree with it?
Rowan.
Hi, yeah, thanks Austin for that talk. I'm sorry, I came in a bit late, so I missed the beginning. But I had a question that was maybe partly for you and maybe partly for the Chinese students as well, to do with one of your comments you just made about whether rural living could be seen as backward. And I wondered whether there's a kind of, I don't know, a status thing attached to the idea of living in a city or in a rural environment, because in our country, in the UK, it's kind of changed over the decades, and depending on, now it's become quite an attractive thing to move back to rural environments as I suppose no longer a commuter because you don't need to commute. And I wondered in China whether there's a sense of status or a class thing about where you live.
Well, I'm happy for a Chinese student to tell me what they think. Obviously, Oning yesterday was at the forefront of some of this conversation about leaving the suburbs and going to remote areas of China, and actually then gentrifying some of those areas. Or I don't think he would use the word gentrifying, but I think he's probably opposed to it, but that's what happened. Anybody out there?
Zoe, are you there? I'm not sure whether I can see.
Oh no, I forgot.
Oh, somebody. That wasn't Zoe. Zoe, are you there? Just thinking.
I can tell you what I think while other people think
Yeah,
other
yeah,
things.
exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, yeah, there is. I mean, look, China is one of those kind of fascinating countries where many people in the West have a perception about what it means to live in a communist state. And in fact, when you get there, you realize that a lot of those illusions are shattered. In my characterization, although this is just mine, right? I think if Ayn Rand was to invent a society, it probably would look a bit like China. It's very kind of fractious, society, but I'm slightly going off piste. The fact is that there's a lot of conversations about, you know, the Better City, Better Life campaign of the Expo in 2010 was as much about, you know, saying we are now becoming an urban society. They were literally on the verge of becoming 50% urban at that point. And therefore, you know, with that comes civilizational gains, right? But then you have to be civilized in order to exploit them and take advantage of them. And so it's one of the, because China is a little bit politically incorrect in Western eyes, you can talk about these things. And to civilize someone sounds terrible in Western context, doesn't it? But actually, if you are a rural farmer and you have been thrust in by chance or by force or by choice to live in a city, you haven't got the first idea of how to flush a toilet, right? Because you haven't seen a toilet, or turn the electric lights on, or whatever it might be. So there's a certain training, as the Chinese government said at the time, to civilize people. Yeah. So the Better City, Better Life had a massive campaign about, you know, no spitting, no flatulence. I mean, you know, whatever it was, right? Was about saying this is what we do in cities, and if we're trying to put ourselves on the global stage as an urban society, we have to train people who are now entering into that society as migrants or urban dwellers in the ways of city life. Yes, and there, by definition, you then had urbanites who had urban hukou looking down their noses at these new incomers. Yes, so not necessarily on the basis of class, but on the basis of low status. Yes, that these are low status people. I mean, you see it in India, you see it in, you know, Pakistan. It's a prevalent thing. But part of the deal then was to tell urbanites, and the civilizational message of Better City, Better Life was to tell the urbanites not to look down on these people because they're trying. We're trying to civilize them. You can't then tell them that they should go back in their box. So it's a fascinating dilemma. So while it sounds crude and tick boxy, you know, in a typical kind of Chinese fashion, actually there's a truth to the fact that to create a city would non-organically, you know, you build a city and then you make city dwellers, it's a shock to the system. Yes, so you're going to have to, in some ways, give them some ideas about what it means to be a city dweller. One other example, which may be slightly again off track, is that there's a shop in Beijing called Beijing Postcards, which is run by some Scandinavians, as it happens. But when they opened up about 15 years ago, they were selling postcards of historic Beijing, right, looking at 1920s rickshaws and all the rest of it, right? And they had people threw stones to their windows, right? But people boycotted it to say, how dare you remind us of our peasant poverty, you know, imperial past, right? We are a dynamic, striving nation. Within 5 years of opening, because the transition in China is rapid like that, people were going there and buying postcards to remind themselves of where they'd come from, because they were certainly losing a certain sense of place in Beijing, which, you know, transformed itself from everything that they ever remembered. So it's a difficult problem, but I mean, I agree with your proposition that there is definitely a contempt shown to people, but that, you know, that's being dealt with.
I think it's really it's really interesting in the context of what the students were doing as well, because of and I suppose the meeting of the two universities, because we can kind of romanticize the idea of living in the countryside without recognizing some of these conflicts.
Yeah, because obviously it can be quite patrician, you know, that you are helping these poor people, right? I mean, in some ways you are helping these poor people, but if you're doing it in a well-meaning developmental mindset, that's one thing. If you're doing it in these stupid peasants don't know what's good for them, I'm going to give them a toilet and they better use it, that's a slightly different attitude. And if you see lots of rural reconstruction is a very technically based idea. You know, it is about water management, it is about, you know, clean water, it is about maybe internal electricity. It is about how maintaining crops, etc. Right. So there is a technical reality that these things are good and you need to be explained what they are, but it's not on a social level, because the creativity or the independence or the autonomy to actually engage in community life is not the same in China, because autonomy and creativity and all that are not permitted in the same way in China as they are over here. So there has to be a kind of a on high offering that you are giving people better opportunities, rather than allowing them to develop, as I say, organically. So it's a generally fascinating dilemma, because on one hand it's good, on one hand it's wrong. Then you can decide halfway house or go either way.
I mean, our experience for the last few days, I don't know what you think, Robert, but the students seem very, very romantic about the countryside, and about not just the countryside, but something that would be described as a relationship to nature. So we've had quite a lot of discussions about the difference that relate to the idea of the difference between being a farmer and being with nature, and made the point that those are different things. And I thought it was quite interesting that you kind of talked about parks and introducing green into the city, and we've talked a lot about nature, whereas actually what we've really been describing is agriculture most of the time. And I know that when I go on WeChat and I look at the posts that people are making, it feels like lots of younger generation, particularly our graduates that then go into offices, they are like office workers sitting there wishing they were in the countryside. And you talk about farmers standing in the field wishing they were in the office. And it's very interesting how this rural urban divide is kind of mixed in with a whole set of generational aspirations and material aspirations at the moment. And I think it would be, I mean, at the moment, it feels like a material aspiration, if you're a young person, is to go to a countryside retreat for the weekend and have a spa. Whether that would ever convert to actually living in the countryside I don't know whether it's realistic. I mean, Oning seemed to be suggesting that he felt COVID had changed things so that it made it more possible, that there were trends which you've indicated of a return to a little bit of a shift in population or a slowdown in the urbanization, that might create more opportunities for this. But all of history in other countries seems to indicate that whatever you do, like we did it, new towns and new villages and all these, the process to draw people to the center, particularly in the UK, is just so strong. But I find that fascinating, like the material forces that are there historically, which constantly draw you to the center, and then the romanticism at the moment that makes you want to be somewhere else and to be able to escape.
Well, I'm just reading this book, cleverly titled China. It's by Kerry Brown,
Right.
but he just makes it very simple. I mean, it's a very simple little history book, but he's making the point, which I think has been made many times before, but the interesting contradiction between the Communist Party's origins of romanticizing the peasantry, or seeing the peasants as the foundation stone for revolution, and the condemnation of urbanites. I mean, that little diagram I showed you of the disappearance of cities in the Great Leap Forward, that was on the basis that, don't trust the urban, don't trust the intellectual, don't trust the professionals or academics, but the peasant is the noble working man. While at the same time, so you're celebrating the peasant, while at the same time, 30 million of them died in order to feed the cities. So you can't get a greater contradiction than that. But there's always been in the Chinese historical narrative the sense that it's in the American one, right? That it's the farmer feeds us all, right? From the old Dust Bowl 30s. So there is in the public imagination a sense that there's something respectful and noble and innocent and not contaminated by bureaucracy that happens in the countryside. But then you've got to make a living. So that's where O Ning's original idea for a country retreat. That's where Dali comes in, where you go and you can go and smoke some cannabis in the mountains and have a lovely 3 weeks off with a British landlady who happens to live there, and then come back refreshed. I mean, it's a holiday, but anybody who's half sensible about getting on in life anywhere in the world will recognize that urban conditions and having a job which actually creates productivity and wealth is a way forward. I sound like some capitalist. I'm not.
You do. And also, I suppose the question that we're raising in this is, can you go against that historical process because of technology? And like we're managing now, we're like in an international dialogue, but I haven't left my home. Well, actually, I've left to come to the office here for the first time for almost 2 years, and it's fantastic. Even though it's only Maya, one person with me in the space, it's better to be with 2 people rather than 1. And yet I'm part of an internet, we've shared our ideas internationally, but so wouldn't it be possible for us to subvert history and the historical process through technology? I'm not suggesting that you answer that, Austin. We're almost out of time, but I know that we've got some people here that may want. Nobody's putting their hand up for me, but are there any other people that? Is there not a Wuhan student that wants to talk to this question about romanticism, about nature, and whether there's a change in attitude towards the countryside? Or are you all really just thinking about dinner at the moment? Come on, one student.
Well, I'm not gonna let you turn off without one question. Somebody has to take it on the chin for the team.
Exactly. How about, I'm just going to pick on.
I know Beloved's desperate to ask a question. I can tell that. Anytime you're ready.
Are you Beloved? No.
No.
Okay.
And Amelia.
Zhu. What about Zhu? Zhu Zijian. What are your thoughts on this? You there?
Yeah, never test a blank screen.
No.
Just in case they're still in bed. Where Amelia looks very keen to ask something. I can tell. Inga, look, she's biting her lip with anticipation with a great question that she has. So fire away.
Or James, we can see James's face.
Hi, I was about to write the question in the chat. You mentioned that the future seems to lead to the combination of the rural and urban. I'm just curious about the rapid growth that China seems to have. With how far into the future do you it will take compared to the West and in China?
Sorry. Well, it's playing catch up, isn't it? So the fact that, as I say, China was 11% urban in the 1980s and is now 60 odd. Lots of, like America, again, depending on how you classify urbanization, and it's written by Western demographic advocates, So it's slightly, the ball is in their court, but the West will tend to be around about 72% urban, and that seems to be 75%. That seems to be like an optimum. Yes, maybe in the future, and I would love to see it, 99.9% becomes urban, right? And you have robots in the fields. But I do think that there's some general acceptance. So China is, but if you think back to Britain or even America 50 years ago, it was around about 55, 58% urban, right? So they've been pushing forward, and China's been rapidly playing catch up and is nearly there. So it's just the goalposts have slightly moved. China was delighted to get to 60% and realized that they still had 50 to go. Anyway, so I think that there's an optimum. And they're aiming to do that by 2030 or 2028.
Okay.
But the question is that the reason that they are now expelling people from Beijing and Shanghai, yes. So again, there's unknown residency numbers because of hidden migrant figures and all kinds of problems. But the general view was there was about 28 million people in Shanghai, and they want to make it down to 25. They want to make Beijing 23 million people, okay? Because there's a certain sense that that's what's permissible. Now, the way they do that, let's take Beijing as an example, is that they are building this Xiong'an new city, which is a major mega urban development. So on one hand, they are saying illegal migrants, you could just call it migrants, they're going to be kicked out of the city and told to go back to the countryside. And in order to encourage them, you can maybe help them set up business, give them grants, maybe set up small industries, etc. Right? So that will satisfy some of those people. Other people will be encouraged to move to Xiong'an because they're going to set up industries and start a new city. So that's more of the Ebenezer Howard motif, that it's not just there's not just a limit, a Malthusian limit on how many people you can have in the city, because you can then maybe start another one very closely linked in by tremendous transport links. So there's still a terrific urban imagination within China. It's just in some ways, because of the speed of the development, there's a very quick catch up between old technology. So that's what I'm trying to say. The railway network, which is an astounding piece of infrastructure, actually is not fulfilling its role because people have discovered cars, and that's taken over. That took 75 years in this country, right? But it's taken 15 in China. So I think that there's a lot of unknowns, exciting unknowns and problematics, but can be overcome. But it'll present hopefully new opportunities. It's a mindset, isn't it? If you see these things as fundamentally problematic dead ends, then you A, might not do it in the first place, and B, weep real tears when it doesn't work. Whereas in China, they seem to be taking on the chin and coming up with new solutions. So building a new city is something which has not been in the public imagination in Britain since Milton Keynes, right? Why not? Because we need some new cities in this country. But even if you say it, people think you're mad, right? So, maybe putting some of that ambition. So I'm a great believer in Chinese ambition, not necessarily the political way of going about it, but I think it's a fantastically ambitious society still.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Inga. And Maya, now I know you're in the same room as Penny. It takes the shine off this internet, doesn't it?
I was just wondering, with the Shanghai 1966 strategy, following Inga's question, with migration, do you know how they're creating a sense of place that is representative of Shanghai for the second generation? Or what's your opinion on the architectural development that sort of appropriates from different cultures to relate to the migrants?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's migrants and migrants and migrants. So there's incredibly poor people who live in very poor conditions on urban fringes still. Not exactly like you'd find in Delhi or Mumbai, but there are very poor conditions that people are living in the major cities. And then there's migrants who work in high-end businesses, in banks and finance, right? But you're still a migrant because you still have that kind of FUGO from your hometown, so you have to go back home to get your social services. there's incredible tensions within that, and it's almost reaching a point where it's been since 1958. Hukou system has been transformed out of all recognition, but it's still a Hukou system, right? It still doesn't. It's like an internal passport system, which doesn't allow you to. So it's be anyway. But I think that the point being is that to create a sense of place. In the UK, we talk about the urban centre or the heart of the city, right, and all those kind of framed phrases that we have because that's the way we've been trained. But what's the centre of Shanghai? What's the heart of Beijing? There isn't one, right? There's hundreds of them, and there's lots of localities. If you go to Beijing, the hutongs, which are the little alleyways and the small little residences, are fantastic local communities. And many people have lived there for generations and never ventured outside Beijing or outside their hutong. So it depends again what you're after and what that Shanghai represents to you. Yes. So when I go to Pudong, I think it's one of the worst places in the world. It's the most awful piece of urban design and management I've ever seen, right? But I get it because it was rapidly conceived and built for a purpose. And hats off to them. But I wouldn't want to live there. But you do tend to find that lots of expats, especially Germans, live there and love it because there are lots of bars and pizza places and etc. So that wouldn't be what a migrant worker would consider to be the essence of Shanghai, right? They might think maybe the old French concession has got something going for it. I don't know, right? So I just think there's many cities in the city, or many communities within the city, and that's fine, right? That's fine. The fact that they're building these new towns and villages and developments will, by definition, shatter existing communities or enthuse a widening of those communities. It depends how it's done. Possibly both those things will occur. So I don't know about you, right? But I think that in some ways, communities are overindulged and over-flattered and overpraised in this country, okay? Because you can have communities of reaction and communities of parochialism and communities of stasis, as well as, wonderful families and happy-go-lucky get-togethers. So I think that if we overstate the value of a community, then the necessary destruction or erosion or transformation of those communities suddenly becomes a problem that we can't countenance. Whereas if you are going to progress and develop a village in this country or build a new city in this country, you're going to have to, as Mao said, break some eggs, right? You're going to have to get rid of some countryside. You're going to have to get rid of existing villages and engage them, absorb them into the new city. But very often in this country, we're too afraid of doing that, or too reticent about even thinking about it. Whereas the ambition may be bigger than the thing that we're praising and trying to safeguard. That was a very convoluted answer, but hopefully you get my gist.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay. If we have time, Craig said, if we have time, what's he said? Somebody in the street where people move into rural due to COVID, is it not inevitable that the following generation then migrate back to the cities, having grown up around rural, creating a yo-yo effect? So Craig's working at the moment, that's why he can't say this himself.
Okay. Well, who knows? I mean, God knows what the impact of COVID is going to be, because it's had a shattering effect on social life. So it's been bad enough in the UK. It's been terrible in Wuhan, but slightly less bad in Shanghai. In Australia, it's gone crazy. Goodness, I mean, I have no idea. So the impact of this is beyond the disease, the virus itself, isn't it? The idea about seeing other people as problems or viruses or contaminants, the idea that you have to isolate yourself, the idea that political life is in your own living room rather than socializing. The idea that we now celebrate chatting online, on one hand, very good. We can talk across continents. On the other hand, very bad. You could not down the pub having a real chat. It becomes formalized. So yes, there's good and bad, but I just think that the COVID reaction will take different effect in different locations, depending on how we see the future and how we see our own, I don't know, our own autonomy and our own ability to transform the world. That's a much bigger question. I mean, I'd be delighted to have more time to talk about it, but I guess I don't. But there you go.
Yeah. Okay. So we will put our hands together and give Austin a very big
Jiang Hao.
thank you.
And just gone.
Oh, has he?
By the way, that first photograph I took of Suzhou actually is part of that documentary. So I really do recommend you come and see it. It's a cracking 30-minute documentary. It's really interesting.
So yeah, he has left. But Jiang Hao is going to talk to you about the film on Saturday. I think it's at 3 o'clock, but it's in the program, and it is absolutely fascinating, that film, for exactly the reasons that we've just been talking about, that it captures the process of change and how it impacts on ordinary people, and it both captures their love and appreciation of being in a place and also their aspirations and their ambitions and how those go beyond places. It's a very interesting reflection onto this question. Tomorrow we've got Jack and Lou, who has called his talk The Soul of Place, and his work is really very inspiring, but he's also clearly grappling with this question of the relationship between the program, of the work he produced, and the specific character of the place. So I think, you know, this idea of something being site specific is something that you guys have looked at today, and being site specific doesn't necessarily mean it's about tying people to a location. It just means the architectural intervention is really grounded in a proper understanding of the context, whatever that might mean. And I think Austin's provided us with brilliant context today to understand what's going on. So can we put our cameras on and take your sound off and give them a big thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Just to quickly say, I got a PDF of the book on China's urban revolution, which I can send you. You can send out to the contacts. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you.
If you want to read it, fine. If you don't, throw it in the virtual bin. But if you have any questions after reading it, then let me know. Yeah.
And should they just email you at Kingston?
Yeah.
I'll
send it to you. I'll send it to you. You can circulate it if you want. Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you all very much. Lovely to see some people. Zhejian, nice to see you finally.
Good.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If the students just stay on the line for a second so that I'll stop the recording. If the students can stay on the line just so